That's what we're looking at this year is history, both the secular history and biblical history. I'm going to divide the next two lectures this way. Today is all secular history, completely. Next week is going to be all biblical history, but we're going to tie in the biblical history with what we're looking at today to see how they dovetail. Go all the way to something brand new for us to look at, the Nile River. I knew this before, that it was the longest river in the world, but here's a very interesting picture of the Nile River. It starts all the way in Central Africa here. You notice what this is? That's the Sahara Desert, but it goes right through the Sahara Desert all the way up to the Mediterranean. The reason it's colored in that fashion is because there was vegetation around the Nile River. This is a much better map. It doesn't show up as strongly as it should, but what it shows in the green sections here is all the tributaries that came off from the Nile, and in the green sections is where there was agriculture. This is where people were able to raise grains and stuff like that. As a consequence, we find that the Nile River and its tributaries are sort of an oasis in the middle of the Sahara Desert. Now, this is an interesting map in a number of other ways as well, and that is that we see an awful lot of tributaries coming off from this Nile River. It starts way down here in Central Africa, and carrying that along with it in the water was a lot of the African soil. And it kept depositing that soil as it went all the way up the Nile River, all the way up to the Mediterranean. And way up here we have the delta, and the delta is really nothing but African soil that has been transported all the way from Central Africa. Furthermore, this Nile River had a tendency to want to flood once a year. And so all these areas here would get plenty of water, plenty of moisture. I'm pretty sure that by the time we get to the Neolithic period, archaeological period, that there were people that had already spotted this as a very interesting place to try to raise grain. And they probably had gotten themselves involved in raising grain way back in the Neolithic period, and were fairly successful in doing that. These are taken right straight out of the Wiki Encyclopedia. The success of ancient Egyptian civilization came partly from its ability to adapt to the conditions of the Nile River Valley for agriculture. The predictable flooding and controlled irrigation of the fertile valley produced surplus crops which supported a more dense population and a social development and culture. Does that sound at all familiar from what we're talking about as far as the Mesopotamian area was kind of the same situation? They reached a point because of the fact that those two rivers that we had in Mesopotamia, those two rivers would furnish the possibility of being able to raise grain every year. The same thing is true here with the Nile River. The interesting thing that happened in Mesopotamia happens here as well. As soon as they're able to take care of the problems that they have as far as feeding themselves, they have time to do what? Development, social development, and culture. And they did get involved in social development and culture. I think the next slide says, with resources to spare, the administration sponsored mineral exploitation of the valley and surrounding desert regions, and the early development of an independent writing system. The organization, and while we won't go with the rest of it, this is the part that I'm most interested in right now, is looking at the fact that they got themselves involved in the writing very early because they had the time to do it. We're going to talk quite a bit about the writing of the Egyptians. I think everybody here is quite familiar with hieroglyphics and the fact that the Egyptian writing has some characteristics of its own. The origin of the writing in Egypt is a little interesting. I've seen two different stories. This story indicates that probably it really did get started in Mesopotamia and somebody took the idea over to Egypt. Whether that's the case or not, I don't really know. But people like to think of the Sumerian as being the first evidence of writing. But at any rate, it's about the same time, about 3200 BC, during the early part of the Bronze Era, that both the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians got themselves in writing. The history of hieroglyphics. I'm just going to read this. The use of hieroglyphic writing arose from proto-literate symbol system in the early Bronze Age around 3200 BC. And the first decipherable sentence was written in the Egyptian language around the 28th century. Now that's not all we're going to say about it. There's a lot more to it. Egyptian hieroglyphics developed into a mature writing system used for monumental inscription in the classical language of the Middle Kingdom period. During this period, the system made use of about 900 distinct signs. Why? Because they used pictures. They used pictures only, but they had to know what those pictures meant. I don't know if any of you run into this, but I had to take language exams when I was in graduate school. And the French department and the German department at Chicago had an interesting system. They had a set of vocabulary that you learned. If you didn't pass that, they wouldn't even look at the scientific translation you made. In other words, just learn a bunch of foreign words. That's exactly what these people had to do if they were going to use this hieroglyphic system. They had to know about 900 distinct symbols. Let's take a look at those symbols. The use of this writing system continued through the New Kingdom in the late period and on into the Persian and Ptolemaic periods. Late survivals of hieroglyphics are found well into the Roman period, extending to about the 4th century AD. In other words, it lasted a long time, but then it stopped suddenly. It stopped, well, that's the end of the Roman Empire as well. When the Roman Empire came to an end, then this hieroglyphic writing came to an end. There's a little bit more to it than that, and we'll get to that in a moment. A little bit about Egypt was a province of the Roman Empire from Rome's annexation of the Ptolemaic kingdom in 30 BC to its loss in the Byzantine Empire to the Islamic conquest. Now let's just take a quick look at this. Egypt was pretty much independent until Alexander the Great, the Greek warrior. After he died, he assigned various sections of his empire to different governors, Greek governors. One of these Greek governors was Ptolemy. Ptolemy was assigned to the region of Egypt. I don't know about you, but for me, I always thought Ptolemy was an Egyptian word because of the Egyptian kings. But they weren't. They were named after a Greek governor. There were about 7 or 8 Ptolemies. Does anybody remember the last of the Ptolemies? Cleopatra. They were not very good in this regard of coming in and governing, because what I read, if this is correct, just one of these Ptolemies ever learned the Egyptian language. Most of them just stayed by themselves and said, we'll rule. The only one that probably spoke Egyptian was Cleopatra herself, the last of the Ptolemies. Rome came into the picture around 30 BC. That's when Octavian and I'll say it, Mark Antony had this great battle of Actium. And that was the end of the civil war of the Romans, and all of a sudden Rome had control of Egypt. And they had control of Egypt up until about 400 and so BC. This is what hieroglyphics looks like. I don't know if you can read that. I can't read that. But I certainly can pick up birds, and I can see that there are pictures in here of various sorts. The next few slides are going to go very fast. Where do you find these? All over the place, all on walls and gateways and temples. Look at that, the hieroglyphics on the walls. There's one of the great temples. You can't really see it, but those are hieroglyphics all on the walls there. There's some more. Here's some pillars. This is kind of interesting. If you take a look at these pictures, you find that these indicate different provinces that we'll talk about him someday. Each one of these has a different symbol inside indicating that's the name of the province. I got to think of a better picture of that here. Yeah, here's the same sort of situation. Shishak was the name of the guy that did this. We'll talk about him some other time. Hieroglyphic script originated shortly before 3100 BC, as I mentioned, at the very onset of the Pharaonic civilization. The last hieroglyphic inscription in Egypt was written in the 5th century AD, some 3,500 years later. I put this in bold print. For almost 1,500 years after that, the language was unable to be read. It stopped just like that. Now, why is that? Part of the reason is that this hieroglyphic, well, let's put it this way. This would be a means of communication. Can you imagine some husband saying to his wife, I'll tell you what, I'm going to build you a wall so that you can put down the grocery list for next week. The hieroglyphics only show up on walls and play where they're pounded in with stone or they're painted or so. Hieroglyphics was used by only the very elite in Egypt at that time. The very elite in Egypt were who? The royalty, the royal families. Estimate that I heard is that barely 20% of the people could even understand what these hieroglyphics are all about. But the royal elite, the elite part of the population, did understand it. Now, there was another form of writing. It was somewhat similar to this. It was still involved pictures, but it was done in a sort of a cursive, and it was not done on stone. It was done on paper with a pen, on papyrus with a pen. It's hieratic, H-I-E-R-A-T-I-C, hieratic. It was used way back at the beginning of the hieroglyphics, largely by the priests. And the things that were written in the hieratic language were usually things that dealt with the worship practices of the Egyptians at that time. In time, there were people that were getting interested in writing for themselves, and that language changed. And by the time we get to 500 BC, by the time we get to 500, well, I'll show that on a different stuff. We get to another language called Demotic. Demotic, which means the people's language. This was a language that was rather significant, and that it gave the regular citizens the opportunity to be able to write. As the years went by, more and more people became more and more cultured in terms of wanting to learn things about their own system, and so they learned how to write as well. But now, as far as that previous slide, that's not insignificant. For 1,500 years, they had all of these things on these walls and on these monoliths and on these pillars and on these gateways and everything else. Nobody could read it. Nobody understood what it meant at all. I'm sure that people were very curious to find out what it possibly could have meant. That came about largely by accident. I like to think of archaeology, modern archaeology, as getting started in the 1800s. Actually, it really didn't get started until about 1845, around in that period. But something happened even earlier than that was rather significant. Whoops. And that was the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. How many of you heard of the Rosetta Stone? Everybody here has heard of the Rosetta Stone. What is the Rosetta Stone? This is a stone carved during the Hellenistic period. That was during the time when the Greeks were still in charge. and believed to originally displayed within a temple, possibly near Sais. It was probably moved during an early Christian or medieval period and was eventually used as a building material in the construction of Fort Julian in the town of Rashid. I think we can see that on the next slide. Way up here is Rosetta. This is where this was discovered. By whom? Well, this great Napoleon's army was in Egypt at that time, and one of the soldiers uncovered this stone. This stone, the Rosetta Stone, was very peculiar to say the very least. Looking at this picture alone, you can see there are three very distinct parts of this Rosetta Stone. I'll get to that. Here's the stone. It was, oh, by the way, you know what happened to the French? They got defeated by the British. So the British were the ones that took the Rosetta Stone home. That's why the Rosetta Stone now is in London. And here is the actual Rosetta Stone. You can see from the size of the people that this was a great big chunk of rock, all right. Now what about what was here? Three very distinct languages. This was hieroglyphics. This was the Demotic. And this was Greek. Now, what was this? Anybody want to make a guess what this was? This was an announcement. Announcement that whoever the Pharaoh was at that time wanted to make darn sure that everybody read it. And how could he make sure that everybody read it? Put it in every language. He wasn't trying to be instructive or anything like that. He wanted to make sure that everybody read it. I tried to find out what was on that. I could not find out what it was. Maybe announcing a dinner or something like that. But those were the three languages that were there. Now let's take a look at this once. This is that Demotic language, the people's language. This was what anybody could read. This was hieroglyphics. Why he put it there, I don't know. But you can see what opportunity now presents itself, and that is, if you can read Greek, you could probably figure out what is in these two languages as well. I think I have a slide here. Oh, here's another picture of the Rosetta Stone. Oh, this is a Hellenic writing. I've got that slide misplaced here, and Demotic. We see that word Demotic, where it comes from. Does anybody know another word that's similar to that? Democracy. It comes from a Greek word. Okay. The translation of these things became very significant. The man that's generally ascribed with the honor of doing this was a Frenchman by the name of Champollion. How he did it, nobody really knows, except that he did know what the Greeks said, and probably tried to find some similarities in the size of words or the position of words in the hieroglyphics that would allow him to translate what that meant in hieroglyphics. And little by little, he was able to get a language put together. The man who was responsible for doing some really significant work in this regard was a guy named William Matthew Flinders Petrie. I like that name, Flinders. It must be a family name. He was really one of the more famous people in that era at that time. He was one of the first Egyptologists. What is an Egyptologist? That's one of these people that takes a look at these translations and tries to figure out what is it that they're actually saying. What is being written here? And there are some other, later on sometime we're going to talk about the other things that Petrie did because they're rather significant. But he was a very important man in this area. I think I mentioned here that Petrie was the guy that developed the method of dating things from pottery. Remember I talked about that last week or so ago, that prior to carbon-14 dating, they had to rely largely on what pieces of pottery looked like in terms of the paintings and the size of the pottery. But Petrie was a significant guy. Whoops. Okay, now we go ahead. This is a picture of Petrie. What did these Egyptologists find? They found that what was written on these walls is what you might expect. If the writing was being done by the elite, who were the elite? The elite were the royalty. And what would the royalty be doing? Recording what they have accomplished. In other words, what we have on the walls in the hieroglyphics is a pretty good history of the Egyptians, written by whom? Well, what did we always say about history? History battles are written, the history of a battle is written by whom? The winners. They're going to be somewhat stilted, but still it will give you somewhat of an idea of what might be going on. Could you believe that they actually might be somewhat biased in their writing? Is it any different from what we have today in political writing? They were doing the same thing. It is somewhat biased, but they were able to, in a matter of a couple of decades, actually define about 30-some different dynasties that existed from the time of the first writing, which was about 200 BC, up until about the time of Christ. 30 very distinct dynasties. What is a dynasty now? A dynasty is nothing more than the lineage of one person who has successive rulers. 30 different dynasties. It'd be a lot of fun to go through all 30, but it would take a whole year to do that. We're not going to be able to look at all 30. There are some that are particularly interesting that we won't be looking at later on. I realize you can't read that too well, but when we get around in this period right around here, we get into something that's a little bit different. In that long list of these dynasties, we run across something that's kind of interesting. And there's one set of dynasties that are in the area of about 15, 16, and 17 dynasties that are different. They're not Egyptian. They're done by somebody else. They are done by people they call the Hyksos. Oops. They're done by the people called the Hyksos. What were the Hyksos? Well, the Hyksos, who were they? Well, that's a good question. There still is some controversy as to who the Hyksos were. They were regarded as foreign warriors or as foreign rulers, people that are not Egyptian. Somehow they got control of part of Egypt. Let's take a look at a map here once. Here, then, what they're called foreign rulers. Here's a map that shows the area that they had control of. They had control of the delta. They had control all the way down to about Thebes. Below Thebes, or up, this is very confusing. When you go up the Nile, you go down on the map, right? From Thebes on down, the Egyptians still had control. But these foreign rulers had control over this particular area. Here's another picture showing where the Hyksos actually were confined. They set up for themselves a city called Erebus. That was their capital. Now, what is the question they should be asking? Who were these Hyksos? Where did they come from? What do we know about them? Well, there are reasons to think that the Hyksos came from the outside. You will get different stories from different parts of Egyptian history that they might have actually fought battles to get control of that area. On the other hand, it could have been a matter of they're simply infiltrating that area. Now, where did they come from? If you take a look at a map, well, this is probably not the best map I'm going to illustrate. They didn't come from the east, that's the Libyan desert. They didn't come from the south. They couldn't have come from the south because that's where the Egyptians were. Go out in this direction, you got the Sinai desert, and then you get to the Arabian desert. North is the Mediterranean. It's very unlikely that they came from up in Greece or places like that. But with this particular map, it shows something else that I think is rather significant. At the time, which is around 1500 to 1600 BC, at the time, there was no Suez Canal right here. Suez Canal does something rather nice right for us now. It separates Africa from Asia Minor. There's a canal in between. But before that canal, what is this? This is Canaan. Canaan was almost like part of the delta. There was sort of a continuum here. True, there was a bit of desert area here in the Sinai desert here, but the people in Canaan, well, who were the people in Canaan? Remember last week we talked about another group of people that had moved to Canaan? The people in Mesopotamia, around this period, actually starting around 1900 BC, started leaving Mesopotamia, started leaving that area in Asia Minor, and moved to a place that was going to be more comfortable for them economically. One of the big reasons that the people were moving out of Mesopotamia was the fact that the population of Mesopotamia was growing such that these people that were in the northern part of Mesopotamia, which we call the Amorites, were nomadic herdsmen. They were shepherds. And they were being squeezed out of their land, and they were looking for another place to go, and they ended up coming to Palestine. They came to Canaan. I showed you a map last week that if you take a look at the topography of Canaan, you find that there is the coast on the Mediterranean, but by the time you get into this region, it's not very good for farming, but it's very good for herding sheep. One of the things that we find interesting is that these people that moved out of Mesopotamia, we call Amorites, what we call nomadic herdsmen, moved into a place where they could practice their culture being nomadic herdsmen. That's, you go back to the Old Testament, how many of the people that we run into in the Old Testament history were shepherds? David's family were shepherds, Saul's family were shepherds, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob were all shepherds. They were all involved in sheep herding, and it was not unusual that they might have come from Mesopotamia and moved into this area. As the years went by, they started infiltrating further and further down toward Egypt and getting more involved with what was going on here in the Delta. For one thing, these people that moved into this area were interested in the business aspects. If they were going to be interested in the business aspects, they had to get involved with what's going on here in the Delta. And it seems that what must have happened is that over a period of time, there were enough of these people that had formerly been Asiatics and came from Mesopotamia that had worked their way all the way into that Delta area. They actually were able to get first economic control, and then eventually actually got some political control, and actually had control over a large part of Egypt, namely the part that flows into the Mediterranean Sea. Now, this is coincidence, purely 100% coincidence. Have any of you read your latest copy of Biblical Archaeology? This is the latest copy. There's a whole pretty big article dedicated to just this one idea. Who were these people that had moved into Egypt in this fashion? Who were they? Well, this article says they were Canaanites. Well, wait a second. We don't call them Canaanites. We think of them as being what? the people that had moved from Mesopotamia. But let me ask you this question. How many of you here regard yourselves as Americans? Yet your ancestors probably haven't been here more than 100 or 200 years, but we've come American. What happens to those people that came from Mesopotamia? They had moved into Canaan, and they had adopted a lot of the customs of the people in Canaan. One of the customs that they might very well have adopted was the religion of the people in Canaan. Now, how do we know that? We know that for some of the things that we read about in the Bible itself. In the story of Moses at the burning bush, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Moses at the burning bush is told that he's talking with Yahweh, and who is Yahweh? I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Does that raise a question? Who was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Well, very likely the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was somebody called El Elyon. E-L, Elyon. He was the head of what you might call the pantheon of all the Canaanite gods. He was the father of all these gods. He was the head god. Now, do you remember another story? The story of Abraham, when he is returning from rescuing Lot. He goes through Jerusalem and he runs into Melchizedek, who was what? A priest of the Most High God. Did Abraham regard that priest as being a priest of the Most High God? Yes. It says he gave 10% of it, he tithed to them. In other words, way back when, there must have been a certain amount of Canaanite behavior that had crept into the culture of these people that had moved from Mesopotamia. And for all practical purposes, you might say that after a couple hundred years, they were more like Canaanites than they were like Mesopotamians from Asia Minor. Now, this particular article, written by a woman named Helen Something, talks about the fact that those Hyksos very likely were Canaanites. It makes good sense. That's the place that's the closest to the delta that could have come from a foreign place, Canaanites. And the Canaanites had slowly on moved into that area to the point where they actually did get enough control that they could set up a capital at Avaris, which was their capital. Now, what kind of archaeological evidence is there? Well, she points out in this article a couple of interesting things, that there are some things that they find in the delta, the Egyptian delta here, this Egyptian delta, that you find only in the delta or you find in Canaan and you don't find anywhere else. One of them is the structure of the temples. In Egypt, they had a very definite structure of their temples, but there were temples that they found in the Hyksos area that were based very much on the temples that you found in Canaan. There was something about the structure, the number of rooms, and the positioning of the rooms. That was pretty straightforward. The other one that I found interesting was the fact that there was a custom that apparently was used in Canaan that also showed up in the delta, and that is burying somebody along with a horse or a donkey. In other words, they found graves where there were skeletons of horses or donkeys. Or this equine burial, as they call it, shows up only in Canaan and shows up in the delta. Again, indicating what? That very likely these Hyksos were people that had come from Canaan. The other one I thought was quite interesting is that the Canaanites had developed something in the pottery making, a way of firing the pottery so that it ended up with a surface, a dark black surface. And the only place you find that in Egypt is guess where? In the delta. Again, indicating that very likely there were Canaanites that had moved in there. And these were the people then that became the what we call the Hyksos. It shows a little bit more of the Hyksos area. This is the delta. This is where they had come from and managed to get themselves into areas like this. Here again, you find that down here, it's Egypt. By the time you get to Thebes, the Egyptians are in control. I'm jumping the gun here a little bit, but you're going to find out about this next week anyway. And if you've read the Bible, you know it anyway. That an awful lot of the people that were in this area were Canaanites and eventually are going to go back from Egypt. That's one thing for sure. Also, when you start the book of Exodus, you find out something. There's a statement that an awful lot of the history up to that point that we find in the book of Genesis, which we'll talk about next week, is centered around one person, who that was, Joseph. And one of the first verses in the book of Exodus says, "And there came a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph." That meant that the Hyksos were going to be driven out, and they were driven out, and the Egyptians got control of this area again. They did get the control. Again, they had to fight a battle. There is a history that was recorded in very good shape in that regard. Immigration by Canaanite populations preceded the Hyksos. Some of these Canaanites might have shown up there very early on, but I won't go into all the details of that. It is kind of interesting that these Hyksos made some interesting contributions. This is a picture of the Semites that came from Canaan and then moved into Egypt. These are Egyptian pictures, by the way. Okay, that's what I just talked about. The 17th dynasty of the Thebes got control again. The Hyksos did bring about some things that are interesting. Some things that the Hyksos brought were the changes that include new techniques in bronze working and pottery. They also introduced the chariot, and I came across something else I found kind of interesting. One of the kings also insisted that the Hyksos record as much as they could about the history of Egypt itself. And a lot of the interesting things that we know about Egyptian history, actually we have to owe to the Hyksos. What have I got? That Rosetta Stone is kind of interesting from another standpoint. It has become a part of the language. A Rosetta Stone is what? Something that is serving in the same way that the Rosetta Stone did with the Egyptian language as a key to how to get started. And I found something kind of interesting in two places in the sciences where this is mentioned. One of them is around 1900, when they first elucidated the structures of some of the carbohydrates like glucose, and found out that these two compounds were the same compound. They look like the same compound. You can't see it from this picture too much, but they are different in that one is the mirror image of the other. They're not the same thing, but they're mirror. Are your two hands identical? 4 fingers and a thumb, an opposing thumb, 4 finger and opposing thumb. You ever put your right hand glove on your left hand, and you find out very quickly they're not the same thing. One is the mirror image. It was the elucidation of glucose in this fashion that led to the understanding of a whole lot of carbohydrate chemistry. Here's another illustration, and that is the hydrogen atom. The spectrum of the hydrogen atom, if you look at this very carefully, you look at an emission spectrum and an absorption spectrum. There are certain lines that keep showing up over and over. When they recognized what the significance was of those lines, that led to the development of the quantum theory. And if you don't think the quantum theory is important, don't turn on your television and don't try to start your car. So much of what we have in our modern world depends right now on the fact that we have made good use of the quantum theory. And the elucidation of the hydrogen atom in this fashion is sometimes referred to as a Rosetta Stone, because it opened up a way for a lot of other things to be happening. I'm sure that there are other illustrations of that as well. Anyway, that's a little bit of the secular history of these people. The secular history goes way, way, way back. And it's rather thorough. I might mention that when it comes to the translation of all of these hieroglyphics, they were able to get a lot done in the 1800s. And there was a whole field, it's called Egyptology. And there were people that regarded themselves as Egyptologists, doing nothing much more than trying to translate what was in these hieroglyphics. Are you getting a really true picture of what life was like from the hieroglyphics? No, you get a true picture of what the political history was like, because it was a thing that was recorded and that lasted. If we wanted to know more about how the people lived at that time, we'd have to go to the demonic and the other writings as well. Now next week what I want to do is I want to take a look at something entirely different. It's all going to be biblical history. And what I want to do is to show how we can take a part of biblical history and show how it dovetails with some of the things that we just talked about today, how it dovetails almost exactly in terms of the time period and the people that were involved in some of the events that actually took place. Does anybody know what I'm going to be talking about? I'm going to be talking about something a lot of people don't realize, but almost a third of the book of Genesis is devoted to one person. You know who that is? Joseph. There's an awful lot about Joseph. Next week we're going to talk about the story of Joseph from two standpoints. One is to take a look at this history that we get recorded in terms of what happened to Joseph and his family. And also, what I think is rather significant is how that story that we have in the book of Genesis is indicative of the fact that this is some of the greatest literature that has ever been written. It is a plot. I think I talked with a couple of folks here about the last week. If you take a look at the story of Joseph, which we're going to go through next week, what a fantastic movie it would make. A lot of the different things. But what I'm finding interesting is that how much of what we learn about from what they have found through archaeology dovetails almost exactly with what we have in the book of Genesis. And until the 1800s, until the translation of some of the hieroglyphics, we had no reason to believe that there was any relationship between what had happened in Egypt during the time of Joseph and what might have really have happened. One of the things that I'm finding interested in doing the things that we're doing this year is that what I'm finding is that there is biblical history that corresponds almost exactly to secular history in many regards. And that all of a sudden takes our religion, the Hebrew religion and the Christian religion, out of a different context from a lot of other religions. It's not supernatural. It's dealing with events that actually took place that are part of history, and it's the history itself. As a matter of fact, we do that in the Christian religion when we recite the Apostles' Creed. Does anybody know something interesting about the Apostles' Creed? Somebody is mentioned by name. Does anybody remember? Pontius Pilate. Why mention Pontius Pilate in the Apostles' Creed? To indicate that the crucifixion of Christ was something that took place at a very definite time in a very definite period of history. And that's what I think we're finding and looking at some of the dovetailing of this secular history with the biblical history, that the biblical history is not just fancy, just great stories, but it actually is based on some events that actually have taken place. Next week, Joseph.